which is from the Ancient Apocalypse show, and where Randall makes the point at the end of it that once we take this into account, the whole story of history is going to change completely, and that's what we're fighting for. We're fighting for some recognition that something really important is
ancient structures built with surprising sophistication.
It's the most amazing archaeostrategic site in North America.
With fingerprints of an advanced prehistoric civilization.
This pillar is like a stethoscope.
The possibility of civilization emerging earlier than we think gets much stronger.
It's going to absolutely demand a rewrite of history as we go.
Ooh. And this is the point. This is the point. This is why I've made this series, because that idea has to get out there. That we got to stop being so complacent about how we look at our past, and for the very same reason, we need to stop being so complacent about how we look at our future as well. We live in a hazardous cosmic environment. It just happens that we live at a time in the human story where, if we chose to do so, we could actually do something about it.
What motivated you to get involved in this? I know Fingerprints of the Gods released in the 90s. It was
1995.
That's when I first read it. Tombsesque. What motivated you to put that out?
It was a process. I used to be a current affairs journalist. I was the East Africa correspondent for The Economist. I had no interest in history whatsoever, but I began to come across things, particularly traveling initially in Ethiopia and then in Egypt, which made me wonder about the past. And, standing in front of the Great Pyramid of Egypt is an awe-inspiring experience, especially when you've never seen it before. And in 1989, when I first saw it, I had never seen it before. 6 million tons, 481 foot high, 13-acre footprint, this massive thing, and archaeologists are saying it's just the tomb of a pharaoh. And yet no pharaoh's body was ever found inside it, or indeed inside any ancient Egyptian pyramid. There had to be another explanation. And I've always been a contrarian. I've always tried to give an opposite point of view. I hate it when there's just a single narrative that says this is the truth and there is no other truth. And so I felt it was important to start giving an alternative point of view, and I started to look into it in depth. Could there be something missing from the story of our past? And that's why I ended up writing Fingerprints of the Gods, to put that information before the public, to allow people access to information that they had not had access to before, themselves, instead of just accepting the word of the so-called experts. The experts know a great deal. I couldn't do anything I do without the work that archaeologists do, but they shouldn't be given a monopoly over the story of the human past. Our past belongs to us, it belongs to all of us. And everyone, whether they're an academic or whether they're a man in the street, they've got something to contribute to the idea of our past.
And the Younger Dryas Impact Theory, when was that first brought out?
2007. That was when it first brought out. It immediately caught my eye. Because when I wrote Fingerprints of the Gods, I proposed that there had been a gigantic global cataclysm about 12,500 years ago. But I didn't really know what had caused it. I suggested a number of possibilities. And then suddenly in 2007, out comes this hypothesis with mainstream backing by mainstream scientists, saying that it looks like there was a series, not just one impact, but multiple impacts all over the Earth around 12,800 years ago that caused this cataclysm. And I began to follow that theory. And by about 2013, it became clear to me that these scientists were onto something really big. And I dived back into it and ended up writing another couple of books, Magicians of the Gods and America Before, which we talked about on your show back in 2019, just to try to put that information out there. And it's fascinating, really, very lazy, the way that archaeologists react to an alternative point of view. In my case, they almost never get to grips with the material that I've put out there in the books. They just say, oh, Hancock, he's a pseudoscientist. He's a fraud. He's a liar. But they never say why I'm a pseudoscientist, why I'm a fraud, or why I'm a liar. They just throw those words out, and you go to Wikipedia, and that's what you see. And the point about Wikipedia is that's the first place, if somebody hears my name or hears about my ideas, first place they're going to go have a look is Wikipedia. And immediately they're going to get turned off. And you can't edit my Wikipedia page. They've locked it. And it's controlled by a group of academics. So I do find this incredibly irritating. But the only thing to do is to keep on going. And this is why, frankly, Joe, your show has been so important, because you're one of the very few people who's allowed this information to get out to the general public, this contrary information which the mainstream doesn't want to hear. You're a powerful platform that's allowed this information to reach so many more people than it otherwise would have reached, and I'm grateful to you for that.
Well, I'm grateful to you guys. I'm really grateful, because this is it's such an exciting notion. It's such an exciting idea, and it makes sense when you look at these incredible structures that we don't really have an explanation for. And when we think about the conventional dating of modern history and modern civilization, they want to put it at around 6,000-ish years ago.
That's right. That's right. And then, you know, that was the view really for decades, that civilization began about 6,000 years ago. And before that, there was no such thing as civilization. And they say that the first big megalithic structures were created by societies that were already agricultural societies. So they were generating surpluses, which allowed specialists to have the time to learn how to be architects and engineers and builders. But then suddenly, out of the blue, and we've got an episode on this in the series, comes Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, which is 11,600 years old. It's 5,000 years old than the supposed oldest megalithic structures, and it's a fucking enormous megalithic structure, probably the biggest megalithic structure on Earth, because so much of it is still underground, although we know what's there because of ground-penetrating radar. Highly sophisticated, 20-ton pillars, beautiful astronomical alignments, buried, deliberately buried by the people who created. They ran it for about 1,000 years, and then they deliberately buried it. And archaeology is still struggling to explain this. They've now had to say, well, okay, somehow megalithic architecture began thousands of years before we thought it began. How are we going to explain this? And they have to accept, this is one of the mysteries of Göbekli Tepe, that the archaeology does show this quite clearly, that when the work began on Göbekli Tepe 11,600 years ago, the entire population there were hunter-gatherers. They were not agriculturalists, generating those supposed surpluses that would allow experts in architecture to emerge. They were hunter-gatherers. And how, in God's name, do a group of hunter-gatherers wake up one morning and create something like this enormous scale? And then the mystery deepens, because at the same time that they're building the megalithic site, they're also suddenly doing agriculture. And I look at that as a contrarian. And I say, I actually don't think that this was something that was just dreamed up overnight by a group of hunter-gatherers. I think I'm looking at a transfer of technology. I think people came to that site who already knew how to do this stuff. And maybe they used that site to mobilize the local population, to push them into a new direction. And that was truly the beginnings of civilization as we know it. But I think it was a restarting of civilization, a reboot, not the actual beginnings. I think there was an earlier lost civilization. And that's the whole point of the show.
What you mentioned about that particular date, 11,600.
Well, it's incredibly important. It's an incredibly important day because the Younger Dryas begins 12,800 years ago with a cataclysm, with a puzzling, mysterious rise in sea level at the same point. 1,000 years of freezing temperatures, mass extinctions of animal species all over the world, and then 11,600 years ago, global temperature shoots up. The last of the ice caps collapse into the sea. Sea level rises enormously. That is the date that work starts at Göbekli Tepe, and that is a point I've made many times, but it's really worth making because archaeologists roll their eyes every time you say the word Atlantis. But that is precisely the date that Plato, which is the earliest surviving reference to Atlantis, that's precisely the date he gives for the destruction of Atlantis, 11,600 years before our time. He puts it this way, that his ancestor Solon visited Egypt, and we know about that visit. It's historically recorded. That visit to Egypt was in 600 BC, and there Solon claimed to have been told by Egyptian priests about this great advanced civilization that once existed, but that angered the gods and was destroyed in an enormous flood. And Solon asked those Egyptian priests, when did this happen? And they said, 9,000 years ago. Well, do the math. That's in 600 BC. That's 9,000 years before 600 BC. We call that 9,600 BC. That's 11,600 years ago. That's exactly the date of the end of the Younger Dryas, and it's exactly the date of what is called melting ridge of pulse 1b, one of the biggest single rises overnight in sea level that ever occurred. So if Plato made it up, it's really weird that he picked a date that is precisely a date that coincides with the latest geological evidence on cataclysmic sea level rise at the end of the Ice Age.
Could be a coincidence, but
A pretty good one.
I will mention I did a two-parter on all of the what Graham's just talking about and the geological evidence that confirms or refutes Plato's account, and it's available on my website for download. And it's like 7 hours of detailed
Yeah, you go deep,
unpacking.
bro. You go deep.
And you see, the academics have never bothered to do this because they, in their pride and in their arrogance, they just say, oh, we know that Plato just made it up. It is just a fantasy. They don't know that. And there's people like Randall coming from the outside who are actually doing the legwork that makes us think about all this again.
And there's plenty of evidence that there were many sites like this that were thought to be just legend and myth, like Troy, for instance, that has now been proven to be an actual real city that mimics the initial descriptions of it.
We should never dismiss myths. We should always listen to them. They're the memory bank of our species, and they may be expressed in symbolic language. There may be wonderful stories built around them, but at the core is factual information. And what better way to ensure that factual information is passed down to the future than to record it in a fantastic story that people will pass on. People love telling stories. They don't even need to understand what the heart of the story is. As long as it's a great story, they're going to keep on passing it down to the future. So I think myth is very important, and that's something that we do in Mythophysics, as we look at the myths. The story of Atlantis is not alone. There are thousands of traditions from all around the world speaking of a global flood that destroyed a former civilization, that brought to an end a golden age.
With all this physical evidence and with all these myths, are there more and more people that are accepting this or exploring this with curiosity and open-mindedness now?
I would say yes, and one of the things that makes me confident that that's happening is because I am getting a lot of emails and communications from people, young people going, you know what, I was watching your stuff and Graham's stuff. I've decided I'm going to go into geology. I mean, I've got dozens. Or I'm going to go into paleontology or archaeoastronomy or archaeology. So just the fact that I'm getting those kinds of communications from people, that's every time I get one, that's encouraging to me. Because I think it's the old axiom that, you know, sometimes, you know, in order to evolve past an entrenched theory, the gatekeepers have to pass away and a new generation has to come along who's a little more willing to look outside that dogmatic framework.
Well, also, if you are a young archaeologist and you're trying to carve your way in the world, what better way than to explore this with tons of evidence that's very controversial theory that's been dismissed?
Takes courage, though. Takes courage on the part of those archaeologists, because they can lose any hope of promotion if they touch ideas like this. Archaeology is a very restricted discipline. If you don't copy what your professor says, if you go off on a tangent, they'll cut you off. There's so many people who've done such great work in archaeology that doesn't fit with the mainstream, and they just get isolated by their colleagues.
I'm hopeful. I really am. And one of the things that gives me hope is Brian Murarescu's the reception of his material. That book, The Immortality Key, which is fantastic, which points to
which I wrote the forward to.
Just ping the collection location through to you. Pick up the goods and bring them back to the warehouse. I don't anticipate any trouble.
All this information. We talked about these ancient clay vessels that show clear evidence of some sort of psychedelic that was mixed in with wine that was probably the origins of a lot of even democracy, like the Enlightenment. A lot of it came from these meetings, and people came from all over the world to participate in these rituals. This is now being widely accepted, and it's a field of study at Harvard.
And you know, let's think about it. If you're locked, this is one of the reasons why psychedelics are being so successful in healing people with profound depression. Because what is profound depression? Otherwise, that you're locked in a very narrow frame that you just can't escape from. What psychedelics seem to do is they break that, and they allow a kind of openness to come in, and new thoughts to come in. So it's not surprising that psychedelics revolutionized the ancient world, and I'm absolutely convinced that there isn't a religion in the world. This is going to annoy a lot of people. That there isn't a religion in the world that didn't begin with experiences in altered states of consciousness. And when we talk about a lost civilization, I believe that was a civilization that grew out of shamanism, and for which altered states of consciousness were fundamental. We're taught to despise altered states of consciousness in our society today. We're supposed to just be alert problem solvers and not doing anything else. But it's out of altered states of consciousness that the real healing happens, and the changes in mindset. People can break free from previous restrictions and move in new directions.
I have mentioned to you a friend of mine, Ben Johnson, former Navy SEAL, 11 years as a Navy SEAL, suffering from PTSD, discovered psilocybin mushrooms. This is maybe 12 years ago, 13 years ago, and he began to, a lot of his brothers in arms also were having the same issues with PTSD, discovered that psilocybin mushrooms were a very effective treatment of it. So he began looking into, he became a grower, and he's perfected, and over like 11 or 12 years, he's perfected the growing technique, and he has now been granted the first federal license to legally grow psilocybin. And they're building a laboratory in North Georgia, and it'll probably be where we eventually get all of our shrooms from. It would be a very interesting discussion for you to talk to. I would love to talk to him about what he's got going on. And I've asked him, if you ever think about going on Joe's show and talk about what you're doing, he said, I'd love to. It'd be very interesting. But yeah, 11 years ago, he saw mushrooms. And now, building a laboratory. He's got funding, building a multi-million-dollar laboratory in North Georgia. I've seen his operation. It's mind-blowingly impressive what he's got going on.
Well, that connects us with Dennis McKenna and Terence McKenna's ideas of human beings literally evolving from lower hominids, experimenting with psilocybin mushrooms.
It's a very powerful idea, and kudos to Terence McKenna. And I never knew Terence personally, but I do know Dennis very, very well. He's a fantastic researcher in this field. Kudos to them for realizing. Terence's book was called Food of the Gods. That the encounters with psychedelics, with ancient psychedelics, were what put humanity on a huge leap forward. And then, unfortunately, we have repressive forces in society that have tried to shut that down and demonize it. But we are missing a very, very important part of our heritage with the attitude that we have to psychedelics right now. And that's why I'm so happy to see that mainstream research is finally getting involved in this. They're realizing that these are real healing vehicles, that they can do things that no other big pharma medicine can do. My only concern is that big pharma takes it over, and that they start putting in, synthetic psilocybin and patenting it in various ways. This again, it's like our past. This is a birthright of all humanity, which we should have a right to. Governments should not have a right to tell adults what they may or may not put in their bodies. Governments should not have that right to hold the keys to our consciousness. These should be matters of personal decision. And for the same reason, looking into the issue of a lost civilization, we should not look for ourselves at first. We should not look for 21st century civilization with all its particular kinds of tech and all its attitudes. We should be open to something very different in the past, which was nevertheless capable of doing extraordinary things.
Is there any evidence that the ancient Egyptians utilized psychedelics?
Definitely. The ancient Egyptians definitely used psychedelics. There are works of art. Their psychedelic of choice was the blue water, which was tinctured in wine. And bottles of this were found in the tomb of Tutankhamun, as a matter of fact. And apparently, I've not experienced blue water lily myself, but apparently induces a deeply altered state of consciousness and opens up visions and possibilities. We shouldn't despise these things.
Do we know what the psychedelic compound in blue water lily is?
I'm not sure. I'm not sure what it is. It's all I know is that it induces a dreamlike visionary state.
So we know for a fact that they utilize this based on...
Yes, we do. Based on those bottles that were found in Tutankhamun's
Here it is. Blue water lilies hold the key to stunning different high. Besides being stunningly beautiful, the blue water lily has some surprising medicinal qualities, ranging from being an aphrodisiac to alleviating pain, depression, to even upset stomachs. The blue water lily also has a dark underbelly. It's got dark underbelly. It's got psychedelic properties that can catapult you into a super high. How's that dark? Also called...
Well, that's the propaganda again.
Yeah.
You see.
The blue lotus. The blue water lily is believed to have originated in Egypt's Nile River and was used by ancient Egyptians as a sacred substance to attain higher levels of consciousness. In fact, it's common to find symbols representing the blue lotus in Egyptian pillars and scrolls.
And that's a fact. It's all over ancient Egyptian art. And Egyptologists will tell you that they're holding those just to sniff the perfume. No, they're not. They're venerating them for their effects on consciousness. And to which we should add that the ancient Egyptian tree of life was an acacia tree. And its bark contains dimethyltryptamine, the most powerful hallucinogen known to man. I don't like the word hallucinogen, but that's the one we have to use. Entheogen, whatever we want to say. The most powerful known to science. And again, fortunately, there is now very interesting research going on into these things. So there are so many forbidden areas of our past which have been forbidden by the experts, by the so-called authorities, which gradually, in the new mindset of the 21st century, we are breaking through to. I think what's special about our time, and by goodness, it's a time of turbulence and a time of difficulty. We are living through a paradigm shift, and that paradigm shift has to do with our attitude to so-called experts. Yes, there is a place for experts, of course there is, but they shouldn't be given sole control over any area of the human story. And what's happening now is that people distrust experts, and they rightly and properly distrust experts, because again and again the experts have misled us. And this is true with psychedelics, and it's true with the study of the ancient past of the human species as well. It's absurd that a small group of academics and archaeologists should literally hold keys to the whole human past and tell us, lecture us, instruct us on how human beings were in the past. There's so much more room for deep exploration on this, and for people who aren't academically qualified to roll their sleeves up and get some work done. Randall is a prime example of that. A man who doesn't come from the field, the background of geology or archaeology, but you've rolled up your sleeves, you've walked the walk. They're still rolled up right now. And you've got up there and you've brought new information to the table, and that's one of the things I'd like to say, that everybody can do this. This is our past, our heritage. It should not be controlled by a tiny specialist group.
We had dinner together in London, and we were speaking about research that's being done on dimethyltryptamine.
Yeah.
Can you talk about that?
Well, that's happening at Imperial College, and I recently attended an event just a few weeks ago with several volunteers in that project. And what's happening is they are legally being given DMT at Imperial College, which is one of the leading research institutes in the UK. And for the first time ever, they're not looking to find out what are the possible therapeutic outcomes of this. They're actually looking at the experience itself. It's very well known, anybody who's used DMT, I've used DMT multiple times, is going to have entity encounters. They're going to meet entities who may sometimes look very weird. They may be part animal, part human in form. They may be almost formless, but yet they speak to you, they communicate with you. And of course the mainstream attitude, this is just rubbish, this is just your brain on drugs. Well, Imperial College, they're now testing that with you. And what they're finding is that these and something else. DMT, as I'm sure you know, Jim, is a very short-acting experience when you smoke it. It's about 12 minutes, maybe less. You're in there, you're plunged into a completely convincing, sometimes terrifying parallel reality. It's so confusing, you hardly know what's going on, and then you're out again. But you come out with a feeling that something's being downloaded. In Imperial College, they found a way to keep people in the peak state of DMT for an hour. They're delivering it through drip, through timed release, and they're keeping the volunteers in an hour in that state. So they have time to find their way around the DMT realm that they find themselves in. And the astonishing thing is that these volunteers, both men and women, are all coming back with accounts of meeting the same aliens and the same world. And it has to raise the question, and I know Rick Strassman has been on your show, and kudos to Rick Strassman, because he was really the first scientist to work with DMT and human volunteers at the University of New Mexico. Rick Strassman is open to the idea that what happens with DMT is that it alters the receiver wavelength of the brain, and that it allows us to gain access to other realities, that these encounters are not unreal, that they're real, but they're real on a level that we can't experience in a day-to-day state of consciousness. We have to be in an altered state of consciousness in order to experience them. And ultimately, the aim of this project is to map the DMT realm. You know, we talk a lot about extraterrestrials and ETs and making contact, and I'm sure the universe is filled with life, and it would be a very good thing to have the tech to make contact, or perhaps not a good thing, with all those other life forms in the universe. But right there in the DMT experience, inside our own heads, we have the opportunity to encounter another world, another realm, entities who are very different from ourselves and who have teachings to give us. And I think we should be spending a lot more research funds on exploring those experiences and finding out what's going on, rather than zooming off to other planets. Let's do both, but let's make sure that we understand that consciousness is an enormous mystery, and at the level of consciousness, DMT opens up literally a parallel world. And there's a nexus here with quantum physics, and with the notion of parallel realms and parallel realities. Maybe we can actually access them. Well, the work at Imperial College ultimately is going to come up with some answers on that.
And so much more cost effective.
So much more cost effective.
Traveling to other galaxies.
Yeah. I mean, let's do that first.
Yeah.
Let's understand what we are. Let's understand what our consciousness is. Let's not just keep locked in this, we're here to produce, we're here to consume, we're here to buy cars. Sure, we're here those are all part of our life today, but it's not all of us. We're much more mysterious, much deeper creatures than that. And psychedelics offer a doorway into another way of exploring human consciousness. And when we do that, we find that there are unseen realities all around us that can be made visible in a deeply altered state of consciousness. And yes, in terms of research funds, it's so much cheaper than trying to, fly off to Mars or wherever. I'm not saying we shouldn't do that. I'm just saying that if we're going to do that, we need to explore the mystery of consciousness. And if we're going to if we're seriously going to engage with the ET abduction phenomenon, with extraterrestrial, so-called extraterrestrials encounters, we must recognize that fundamental to this is consciousness. It's not just physical.
It's there for taking. Get it and bring it back to the warehouse.
I wrote a book back in 2005 called Supernatural Beings with the Ancient Teachers of Mankind. And it is astonishing, Joe, how encounters that were described as encounters with elves and fairies in the Middle Ages, encounters that shamans to this day describe as encounters with spirits, that all the characteristics of those encounters apply to encounters with so-called extraterrestrials today. It's as though in each generation, each civilization, we construe experiences according to our cultural background. So they call them fairies and elves in the Middle Ages. Shamans call them spirits. We call them ETs today. But if we're really going to crack this problem, and it is a problem, and it is a mystery, I'm not dismissing it, it's a very important mystery, we're going to crack it. We're going to have to use psychedelics to explore the mysteries of consciousness.
Yeah, I'm very excited that the attitudes about this stuff from the general public, people are much more open than ever before. I mean, ever in my lifetime. I remember discussing with people doing DMT in the early 2000s. What is wrong?
Yeah,
Exactly.
What are you, crazy?
Exactly.
And now almost everybody and their cousin has a story about, trying ayahuasca or doing psilocybin, having some sort of an experience.
Very well said. I would say it's part of the global change, which is extremely healthy, which is a change of just accepting what the experts tell us. Oh, a scientist said this, so it must be true. We're starting to think for ourselves. We're not willing any longer to be told what to think. We want to find out for ourselves, and that attitude is very much related to psychedelics. And when people explore the psychedelic experience in a responsible way, and psychedelics are very serious business. You and I both know this. They're very, very serious business. I would not encourage children to take psychedelics, but actually if we want to keep children away from psychedelics, it would be far better to make them legal than leave them illegal and available on the black market. I think it's something for the mature mind, but I regard it as a fundamental human right of adults to be able to explore our unconsciousness so long as we do no harm to others. And I see this attitude spreading much more widely in society. What the hell is that guy in a suit? What right has he got to tell me how I treat my own health or how I treat my own consciousness? So long as I do no harm to others, that is entirely my business and nobody else's.
Agreed. And if this is the source of civilization, or one of the reasons why people were able to think so creatively and create these incredible structures thousands and thousands and thousands of years ago, this all does coincide with this work about these apocalyptic scenarios that you guys are talking about, because if we don't have an understanding of how we got to where we were, and we also don't have an understanding that this can happen to us again, it's very possible for us to happen again.
It is indeed possible for it to happen again. And in the 8th episode of Ancient Apocalypse, one of the scientists from the Comet Research Group makes that point, that the comet that disintegrated, that caused so much damage on Earth 12,800 years ago, its debris stream is still in orbit. The Earth passes through it twice a year. And in the next 30 years, we're going to be passing through a very lumpy bit of this 30 million kilometer wide debris stream. It's called the Taurid meteor stream. We should be paying much more attention to that, because it's not doom and gloom, because we can do something about it should we choose to do so. And let's stop focusing all our efforts on fighting one another and hating one another and filling the world with anger and fury. And let's work together as a human species to make life on this planet better for everybody. That's what's going on now. There's a new mindset which is coming into force, and I celebrate the youth of our society today, because they are refusing to be bound by the orders that are given to them by the powers that be. There's a new spirit of thinking for ourselves, and that new spirit is, in my view, going to change everything. It seems like a dark time right now. A lot of stuff is going on. That's always the case when you're in the middle of a paradigm shift. It seems like a dark time, but we're privileged to live in this, because 200-300 years from now, this time is going to be looked back on as a turning point in the human story.
We might mention that, speaking of the Taurid meteor shower, we are passing through the Taurid meteor stream right now as we speak.
As we speak.
Late October to about the second week in November, up to about the 15th or 17th of November, Earth is passing through that stream. And it probably is the most important meteor stream in terms of the history of recent life on this planet. And this goes on, people like Bill Napier and all of those guys who...
Major astronomers are very aware of this, and it's almost like something is trying to shut them down, stop the word getting out there. Yes, NASA has a search for near-Earth asteroids, but weirdly they're not paying any attention to the Taurid meteor stream. We know that there's 200 objects in the Taurid meteor stream that are a kilometer or more in diameter. Comet Enki, which is at the heart of the stream, is almost 5 kilometers in diameter. It's all part of. These are all fragments of that original giant comet that began to disintegrate 12,800 years ago that the Earth ran into.
So is this? What are you showing me, Tony?
Video on Twitter of Taurid meteor stream.
That's a great time to see
Fireball.
Yeah. That's exactly what happens. We're in that time period now. Unfortunately, most of those fireballs are caused by little objects. Maybe the size of your fist, maybe just the size of a fingertip, maybe just a speck of dust burning up into the atmosphere. But they are shrouding very large objects that are on that same orbital trajectory which the Earth crosses this year. And we should be paying attention to those large objects because we can actually do something about them. And the evidence shows that they did something terrible to the Earth 12,800 years ago. And they changed everything.
And that is what this Netflix series is all about.
That's what Ancient Apocalypse is all about. It's why it's called Ancient Apocalypse, because that's what it ultimately comes down to. Now, there's masses of material in the series about the possibility of a lost civilization and presenting the evidence for a lost civilization. But ultimately, when you talk of a lost civilization, how did it become lost? What happened that took it away, that obliterated it from human memory? And this apocalyptic episode called The Younger Dryas is the answer to that. The point I often make, which I think is worth making again and again, is how different the world was during the Ice Age. Mm-hmm. The Sahara Desert was green. It was a fertile place. Nobody's doing much archaeology in the Sahara Desert today. The Amazon rainforest, 5 million plus square kilometers under deep canopy. Hardly any archaeology is being done there, and yet we know from LiDAR surveys that there are enormous structures under that canopy. And then what about sea level rise? 400 feet sea level rise at the end of the Ice Age. The prime real estate on Earth, 27 million square kilometers. It's about 10 million square miles. Were submerged by rising sea levels at the end of the Ice Age. And again, archaeology, there is marine archaeology, but they're not really looking very closely at that. I wonder, Jamie, would it be possible to pull up the diving clip?
Is this from Japan?
No, this one's actually from Bimini. We have an episode on Bimini and on the very controversial structure called the Bimini Road.
Oh, right.
And this is just a little clip from that.
My suspicion is humans are a species with amnesia. We have forgotten something incredibly important in our own past. And I think that that incredibly important forgotten thing is a lost advanced civilization of the Ice Age. I've spent decades searching for proof of this lost civilization at sites around the globe.
Oh, wow.
Now, my aim is to piece together these clues.
And that seems extremely strange.
To show you evidence that challenges the traditional view of human history.
You see that?
The Bimini Road.
The Bimini Road, it's not even very deep. It's only about 20 feet deep. It was one of the last things to be covered by Ice Age sea level rise, and that's why we show a graphic, a reconstruction of it above water. It's made of extremely regular blocks, megalithic blocks, on a very large scale, more than 1,000 feet in length. When you dive on it, and I've dived on it multiple times, and I went back to diving in order to dive on it again in this series. It's impossible to believe that it's entirely a work of nature. And I took a marine biologist there with me who's dived all over the world, and he agreed with me that there's just no way that this thing can be explained as a totally natural phenomenon.
Can we see it, Jamie? And what is the conventional reasoning for this?
The conventional reasoning is that it's just beach rock. Fractured into natural patterns. But when you get there and get underneath those rocks, you see that they're propped up, they're leveled out with rocks underneath them, that the whole thing is being very carefully structured by human beings. And the point is, and another point I'd like to make is Bimini today is a tiny, tiny island. But Bimini during the Ice Age was part of an enormous island. The whole Grand Bahama Pact was above water. An enormous island, and weirdly, that island turns up on an ancient map. It turns up, that's not the Bimini Road. But that is on the left, that's the Bimini Road. You've got the restaurant. Yeah, those are shots of the Bimini Road.
God, it's hard to believe these uniform stones occur naturally. And how long is this?
About 1,000 feet in length, and it's not just a straight line, it's got a J-shaped curve at one end of it as well. And we know that it's been underwater for about 6,000 or 7,000 years, but the question is, how long before that was it made? how long did it stand there above water? The very prominent point on this ancient island that we now call the Grand Bahama Banks. And one of the mysteries I look into is that on an ancient map, the famous Piri Reis map, drawn by a Turkish admiral in 1513, that Grand Bahama Banks as an above-water island is shown. It is featured on the Piri Reis map. And what do you see running down it but an image of the Bimini Road above water? Now, how could Piri Reis, who drew his map in 1513, have known this? He tells us the answer, that he based his map on more than 20 older source maps, all of which are now lost. And he suggests that those maps had come out of the famous library of Alexandria, and that they'd been taken to Constantinople, and that's where he got access to them. Somebody, I believe, was mapping the world, was exploring the Earth during the Ice Age, and left us ancient maps that show features that only existed during the Ice Age.
Oh, that's the Orontius.
No, this is Piri Reis.
Oh, that's Piri Reis.
Just got it on side, but down, it's on its side at the moment, but
Yeah.
down there in the lower left, if you bring the cursor down, that big island down there in the lower left, that island is exactly where the Grand Bahama Banks were, an above water version of the Grand Bahama Banks during the Ice Age, and that feature running down the middle of it looks very like the Bimini Road to me.
It does.
Wow.
So again, it suggests not only do we have a cataclysmic event that changes the face of the Earth, but also we have evidence that somebody, as yet unrecognized by archaeology, had the capacity to explore the world and to map the world during the last Ice Age. One of the things I find most striking is the presence of Antarctica on ancient maps, because we didn't discover it until 1820, and yet it's on maps drawn in the 1500s with great detail, which again were based on much older source maps that have now been lost to us. The astonishing thing is the so-called Pinkerton World Map. I don't know if you can find it, Jamie. Drawn, I think, in 1813 or 1818, based on the latest exploration data at that time. And where Antarctica is, yeah, that one. Keep going right. That one. That one you've got up at the top there. It just shows a hole where Antarctica is. Because it was an honest map. Nobody had found it by then. But if you go back to, for example, the Wolsey-Muller World Map drawn in 1530 or thereabouts, you find Antarctica is present. If you can find Wolsey-Muller World Map, it would be worth taking a look at. Orontius Phineus. Go for Orontius. Oronteus. Phineus. Finnaeus. The Orontius Phineus map. That map shows Antarctica exactly where it should be, and it shows right hand side. There's Antarctica at the tip of South America, just south of South Africa.
And what did they call it back then?
Well, they call it the Southern Land, and it's larger than it is today, but it was larger than it is today during the Ice Age. Antarctica was a much bigger. Now, what the fuck is it doing on a map drawn in the 1500s, which we know was based on older source maps when nobody knew it existed in the 1500s? To me, the obvious answer is we are dealing with the fingerprints of a lost civilization that mapped the world and that left evidence of that mapping, which ancient mapmakers found and used and integrated into their maps. These maps can be very confusing because they were trying to mix exploration data from their own period with data from the older maps. But when you look at these maps in depth, they're very, very intriguing.
When you go back to what you think are the origins of sophisticated civilization, how far back are we talking?
I think that we really... See the t-shirt I'm wearing?
Stuff just keeps getting older.
Yeah, this is my motto. My kids gave this to me for one of my birthdays. It's partly an ironic comment on myself because, fuck it, I'm getting older. I'm 72 now. It's partly an ironic comment on myself, but it's partly a comment on something else as well. Is that as science progresses, we are finding evidence that the human species is much older than we thought. Go back 25, 30 years, you'll find people telling you that anatomically modern humans didn't exist until 50,000 years ago. Then they found evidence of anatomically modern humans 196,000 years ago. Then in Morocco, they found evidence of anatomically modern humans 300,000 years ago. Humans just like us, with the same brains, the same capacities, the same abilities than us. Once you start extending that timeline back, you're leaving much more room for an advanced civilization to emerge, a civilization that was ultimately destroyed. If you've just got 50,000 years to do it with, it doesn't leave you much space. But if you've got 300,000 years to play with, there's plenty of space. So bottom line, I think this was a civilization that flourished during the Ice Age, that occupied the prime real estate during the Ice Age along coastlines, and that was obliterated almost completely in the cataclysm of the Younger Dryas. There were survivors. Those survivors left their fingerprints in places like Göbekli Tepe. After the Younger Dryas was over, they then sought to initiate hunter-gatherers into their system of knowledge.
Only sold by
when you're
yours
talking
truly.
about the Nile, and we're talking about
Can't be
ancient
found
Egypt,
anywhere but this
how far
van.
back do you think that
Guaranteed.
Oh, I think the Nile goes back a very, very, very long way. The Nile River system 12,500 years ago looked much the same as it does today. Actually, Africa suffered much less from sea level rise than many other continents. The place that was most dramatically affected by sea level rise was around Indonesia and Malaysia. Geologists call it the Sunda Shelf. And again, it shows up on ancient maps as it looked during the Ice Age, not as it looks today. There was a continent-sized landmass that went underwater there. If your continental shelves are very shallow, very, very limited and very deep, then you don't lose a lot of land. But if they're slow and gradual, you lose a great deal of land. Africa didn't suffer so much. The Nile River system was pretty much 12,500 years ago the way that it is today. The big difference was that the Sahara Desert was green and fertile.
And this coincides with Dr. Robert Schoch's assertion that when you look at the Temple of the Sphinx, you're dealing with thousands of years of water erosion.
Yes.
And the last time there was water like that in the Nile Valley was when?
The last time you had the water erosion like that in the Nile Valley was precisely during the Younger Dryas. The Younger Dryas was a period of extremely heavy rains in Africa. And it's erosion caused by heavy rains that is the enigma on the Great Sphinx. We're not saying that there was a flood came over the Great Sphinx. What Robert Schoch is saying, and what his evidence clearly demonstrates, is that we're looking at what's called precipitation-induced weathering. Weathering that was caused by exposure to about 1,000 years of extremely heavy rainfall. And Dr. Robert Schoch puts that 1,000 years precisely in the Younger Dryas period. That's the last time that rains of that magnitude fell on Egypt, and it's why we cannot sensibly accept the insistence of Egyptologists that the Sphinx is just 4,500 years old. By all means, yes, 2,500 BC, the ancient Egyptians were there, but I believe they found the Sphinx already created and already heavily eroded, and that they then recarved its head into the head of a pharaoh. And that head, as Robert Schoch and others have pointed out, is way too small in relation to the body. That makes sense if it was a heavily eroded lion head, which was then later cut down into the head of a pharaoh. The geology speaks to the original Sphinx being more than 12,000 years old. And that's the funny thing, because when Robert Schoch, and let's not forget John Anthony West. John Anthony West, and I know you had him on his show before he passed. John Anthony West was the first person to suggest that there should be a huge question mark over the Sphinx, that the erosion patterns on the Sphinx suggest it was much older than Egyptologists say, and maybe 12,000 years old. And at that time, the response of Egyptology was, rubbish. The Sphinx can't possibly be 12,000 years old because there's no other megalithic monument anywhere in the world that's anywhere like 12,000 years old. Well, that got blown out of the water completely, forever, by the discovery of Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, which isn't even that far from Egypt. Göbekli Tepe, 11,600 years old, a giant megalithic site. My goodness, if you can make Göbekli Tepe, you can make the Sphinx. It adds hugely to the credibility of Robert Schoch's argument, and I want to pay tribute to Robert Schoch, because there's a mainstream academic who's been willing to stick his neck out. Despite taking all sorts of slings and arrows from his colleagues, he sticks with the data. And what the data says regardless of what Egyptologists say, is that the Sphinx is 12,000 plus years old.
And Jamie, can you pull up some of the images of that? Because it is really compelling. When you look at the water erosion evidence that is all around the Temple of the Sphinx, it's really fascinating stuff, even for someone who doesn't know much about erosion. But when you look at it through his descriptions and his understanding of the various levels of stone, how some of it is harder, and this is the reason why some of it is eroded less.
You see it most clearly in the trench surrounding it. You see it there.
Right.
Those deep vertical fissures are classic precipitation-induced weathering, classic weathering produced by rainfall pouring over the edge of that. You don't see it so much on the body of the Sphinx for a very specific reason, that the body of the Sphinx has been repeatedly restored. Some of those blocks that we're looking at there were actually put in place during the Old Kingdom, when the Sphinx is supposed to have been made from new. What were they doing restoring the Sphinx 4,500 years ago if they'd just built it? You know, logic needs to be applied to this whole process, and we need to free ourselves from the dogma of the academic mainstream. And
so if this water erosion began thousands and thousands of years ago, thousands and thousands of years earlier than conventional Egyptologists date this era, how old do you think that actual civilization was, and how far back?
I think it could go back 20,000 years before that. I think it was around all that time. And again, this is a point that I think needs to be made. Archaeologists will tell you that the entire population of the Earth were hunter-gatherers during the Ice Age, say 20,000 years ago, peak of the last Ice Age. Everybody was hunter-gatherers, according to archaeologists. But we today live in a world where an advanced civilization, our own, if we dare call ourselves advanced, and in some ways I think we're not advanced at all, coexists with hunter-gatherers. There are hunter-gatherers in the Amazon rainforest. Some of them don't even know we exist. They've been spotted from aerial surveys. Hunter-gatherers in the Namibian desert. The notion that different types of civilization can coexist on the same planet shouldn't be surprising to us, because we did it. And that's what I'm suggesting was the case back then. But a civilization very different from the world. They certainly have technology, enough technology to explore the Earth, enough technology to map the Earth, very advanced astronomy, knowledge of obscure astronomical phenomena such as the precession of the equinoxes, such as the obliquity of the ecliptic. I won't go into details, but it's present in ancient knowledge. There's an amazing book, which I may have mentioned to you before, Joe, a book called Hamlet's Mill. And it was written by two professors of the history of science, Giorgio de Santillana and Hertha von Deschen, back in the 60s. And what that book is dynamite, because it shows, going back into the oldest myths and traditions of the world, highly advanced astronomical knowledge. Astronomical knowledge that should not have been possessed by hunter-gatherer civilizations. Astronomical knowledge that could only have been accumulated through thousands of years of careful observation and recording of data. That astronomical knowledge is present in the most ancient myths of mankind. And in fact, it was that book, Hamlet's Mill, just as much as my first experience in front of the Great Pyramid, that led me to begin asking questions about the narrative of our past. And I think it's healthy that we should have an alternative narrative. And I can't understand why archaeology is so, I have to say, so afraid of alternative narratives. Because if they're not afraid, why do they react in this way as though we're some kind of existential threat? Why do they block me from getting access to sites if they're not afraid? If they're confident of their position, they should be able to maintain it against all opposition, rather than trying to censor other points of view.
Now, the Great Pyramid of Giza is probably the most stunning of all these ancient structures. And the stones are immense, and some of them were cut from a quarry that's hundreds of miles away. How do you think they did that?
Well, some of them, the granite in the Great Pyramid comes from more than 500 miles to the south. If you look at the famous King's Chamber, its walls and its roof are...
And then we're going to turn around and snipe the driver on existence. So I'm going to looking like where you found the next spawn. This exact location on the map. It's not on Mount Chiliad, it's the mountain left of Mount Chiliad. This is the spawn location towards Mount Chiliad, which is right there, and face our back to the spawn location because the Mariachi Tornado is going to be spawning exactly at 7 p.m. in game time, right over here. So as you can see on the phone, it's about 6 p.m. right now. Once it gets to about 6:30, you want to permanently be looking this way, and then once it turns 7 p.m., so 1900, helicopter or no pro. My main sniper is actually an explosive sniper, and I
the ceiling of the King's Chamber are all made with gigantic granite blocks.
Stunning detail.
Stunning detail. Those blocks on the roof of the King's Chamber weigh 70 tons each. Now, Egyptologists will tell you that, oh, they could move heavy blocks because they put them on wet sand and they push them along on wet sand. Well, maybe if you're just at ground level, that will do. But when you're 350 feet above the ground, as you are in the King's Chamber, that won't do at all. I don't know how they did it. All I know is they did it. I don't think anybody knows how they did it, how they lifted those stones, how they brought them up to that level. I think we're looking, again, at a lost technology. And it was this ancient apocalypse 12,800 years ago that wiped that from the human memory banks almost completely. Not entirely completely because there were survivors, but removed most of it. Randall will tell you, sea level rise, it creates a powerful high energy zone. Anything that was existing on those flooded coastlines has just been pounded to hell. I mean, talk about it, Randall.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's going to be a lot more energetic than now. I mean, imagine your sea level rising at 3 or 4 times at least faster than we've seen rise in the last century. And within there, juxtaposed are these episodes of very rapid sea level rise. So you're talking about a very energetic intertidal zone. And anything that's there, short of large megalithic blocks, is going to be utterly obliterated by the time the process is through. And I think that this is one of the things that, you know, the archaeologists and the prehistorians, people are looking at that, have failed to take into account the severity of these events we're talking about. Because the question always is, where are the artifacts? Where's the pottery? Where is the evidence that this civilization existed? And I have 2 responses to that. One, you don't realize the extent of the total remodeling of this planetary surface that took place. Because, I mean, we could get into some of the stuff here. I have tons of images where I think maybe we'll get a chance to pull up a couple of really awesome drone footage here before we're done. But once you begin to wrap your head around this, you go, really? You know, it's like, imagine that you drop an atomic bomb on a city and it completely obliterates it. And then a short while later, you drop another one on the same place. What's going to be left? And then 10,000 years, 20,000 years goes by. What are you going to what are you going to find? What are you going to look for? You know, it's going to be just rubble that gets reincorporated just into the geological stratum, and it's going to be very difficult to differentiate, for example, from what's called a conglomeratic rock, which is basically we have just a huge jumble of broken rock cemented together, right? Now within there could be all kinds of stuff that's not even recognized as being artificial in the sense that humans had anything to do with it. The other thing is when we talk about these ancient technologies, if we're only looking for a mere reflection of ourselves, we could overlook it completely, because I think there's evidence that exists now. I mean, some modern researchers whose work has been buried or suppressed, I think we're getting very close to rediscovering some of the things that our ancient ancestors were up to. And maybe this would be worth a whole show in itself. We could dive into this, and I don't want to get into that today.
Well, what kind of technologies are you talking about?
Well, I shouldn't really get into that.
Get into it.
Get into it, Randall.
We got to get into it.
Okay, well...
We've opened the door, sir.
Okay. Well, okay.
The passing of the HDMI cable.
The passing.
A sacred moment.
Well, there are people out there now who have been working on trying to rediscover that. And again, I don't want to digress too much into this now because I would really rather be able to give a whole treatment of it, and it might kind of derail us a little bit from this. But there are people who've been working on these things for decades now, basically in secret. And I've had the privilege of talking to some of these people over the last 6 or 7 years. And right now, as we're speaking, there's a group of people who are basically going to open source a whole lot of stuff in the next 3 months, so it can never get suppressed again. And that's why I'd like to come back and talk in more detail.
Well, I'd love to have you come back and talk about it, but we got to talk about it a little bit now.
Okay. Well, there's a laboratory right now in the Maldives that's been building prototypes using these technological principles, which are based on implosion rather than explosion. And the inspiration for this...
Tesla's ideas are part of it, I think you mentioned.
Tesla's ideas are very much a part of it. Yes, Tesla's ideas are very much a part of it. So is, I don't know if you ever, Victor Schauberger, who did the work with water and discovered, look at, Jamie, could you look up Victor? Oh, I have the cable now, don't I?
Take it back. Let me find it.
Well, no. Let me pull something up here, and
I think the key thing is we're looking at technologies that are not the same as ours.
Yes.
And that's partly why archaeologists can't see them, because they're looking for us in the past, and they're not open to the possibility that there are whole other kinds of technology that could be used.
Right.
I always go back to the ancient Egyptian traditions that speak of priests chanting as these huge blocks were lifted into the air. Were they using some kind of sound effect, some kind of use of sound that was able to manipulate matter? We know that sound can manipulate matter, as a matter of fact, but they're lifting these blocks. Again and again it appears in ancient Egyptian traditions. The notion that we could lift huge blocks with sound seems absurd to archaeologists, and yet it's there in the traditions of the Egyptologists. And what Randall's talking about now is people who are working on a whole alternative path of technology, and maybe that's a rediscovery of the kind of technologies that were used by a lost civilization.
I think that's what's important about what you're saying, is that we have this very limited idea of technology based on what we've experienced.
Yeah.
But if you had anatomically similar human beings that lived for thousands and thousands of years.
Stuff just keeps on getting older.
If you think about the amount of progress that we've achieved as modern humans just in the last few hundred years.
Yeah.
If you go back 400 years to now, it's a stunning amount of achievement.
Absolutely stunning.
And if you have a completely different path of technology, one that's not utilizing internal combustion engines and cranes and the like that we experience
leverage,
today.
Mechanical advantage, everything that our tech is based around.
Something that's insanely advanced, tens of thousands of years of a different path.
Yeah.
And that may be what we're looking at.
And that may begin to explain these otherwise inexplicable monuments that have survived.
Jamie, do I need... There we go. This is the work of Nikola Tesla. And he was... Again, this is way too much for us to get in today. That's why we need to devote a whole session to talking about this.
Okay.
But this is... this was the inspiration. You know, his work was suppressed. A lot of his patents were taken, sealed up by the U.S. government for whatever reason. I don't know. But this is some of the stuff that's now being developed using his ideas, plus some of the others. This is the man I've been talking to for the last 7 years.
Malcolm Bendall?
Yes. And again, I don't want to get into it today, but here's an example of what they're doing. This is a generator that has no moving parts. It's all based on geometry, pure geometry. And here's the basic idea, as I think I understand it at this point. Resonance frequencies. Everything vibrates. Have you ever, if we had an electric razor, we plugged it in, turned it on, set it on this table, it's going to move around, isn't it? You ever seen that?
Yeah.
that's the beginning of the concept because it's vibrating. Everything vibrates at a frequency, and if you know that frequency, you can control things. And I think that's the basic idea of what we're looking at here. And it's all based upon the ancient numbers. And they're developing technologies right now, and they have been. I was recently contacted and given the go-ahead that I could talk. I've been sitting on this for 7 years without talking about it because they asked me not to talk about it until they had their patents in place and their licensing. That's all happened since last summer. So we're now free to talk about it. So that's what I'm saying. I think it would be a good idea to get me back on here. We can look at it. I'm going to lay this on Graham so he can look at it too, because I really want to get Graham's feedback on this.
I mean, would it be fair to say that there's an element of a rediscovery of a lost technology from the past?
I think it would be fair to say that, yes.
And so through this technology, they're able to move stones or cut stones or all the above?
All the above.
And even transport them? Whoa, what is all this?
Well, this is the model. And this is diagramming all the frequencies of the elements and what their vibrational frequencies are and the numbers that measure those frequencies. And they're all the numbers we get from looking at these ancient traditions that recur over and over and over again, that I've been talking about in my sacred geometry classes for decades without knowing what the final result was going to be. So this inventor who's working with this small group contacted me, and this is what he told me. He said, you built the foundation. He said, you laid the foundation with your work on ancient geometry, and I built a house on top of it. That's what he said. Nice. So for 7 years, he's been supplying me with all the information. I have copies of all the patents. I have videos of the testing of the prototypes. And Mazda, the car manufacturer in Japan, is getting ready to do a $25 million testing of some of these prototypes that they believe they can retrofit internal combustion engines with. And there's over 100, they've developed over 100 patents on some of this stuff. And it's amazing.
And what would be the fuel?
Well, plasmoids. Plasmoids, as it says here, are donut or toroidal-shaped clusters of net protons or net electrons that once captured and placed into a toroidal orbit are capable of absorbing, storing, and releasing enormous amounts of energy within their self-generated and structured electromagnetic containment field. Plasmoids, in effect, function as an atomic battery that can be self-charging due to its ability to convert matter to available clean energy. So it's a lot to get into, and I think it would take us kind of off what we're here to talk about.
But
today,
at least what's promising is that there is some, at least, research or understanding.
And it's actually quite mature at this point. And in order to avoid the kinds of fate that befell Tesla and Reich, Robert Oppenheimer, Victor Schauberger, and so many others that were working in these fields, all kind of converging on this same insight. It's been conducted in secret. The laboratory that they've been developing this is in the Maldives, so that it's been immune from government interference. And now I think it's about ready to go to the next.
Now, what is the motivation of the suppressing of this information?
I think in case of Tesla, wasn't it military, the fear of military applications?
I also think that, you know, there are huge corporations that have very large investments in a particular path of technology, which is ours.
Right.
And for somebody to come up with a whole new path of technology, very threatening to them. And much better from their point of view to suppress it, or if they can't suppress it, to kind of buy it and hide it, and keep things on the track that they're on now. I would say that's the motive.
And maybe for people that are curious about this and maybe even skeptical, consider the massive change that nuclear power provided us. Whereas before the 1940s, this was unheard of.
Yeah.
This even the concept of it. And all of a sudden, now we have nuclear power, nuclear weapons, the most profound power known to man currently.
God help us, it's a power for use by adults, but unfortunately it's delinquent children who are leading our world right now. The leaders of our planet, the politicians out there, They're just complete arseholes. I can't think of any of them who I feel any respect for whatsoever. And it's they who are in charge of this frightening, terrifying technology. We just aren't mature enough as a civilization to manage technology like that. You have to get that level of maturity.
And I don't think it's a coincidence that these people they're not psychedelically experienced.
Exactly. I've said it on your show, and I'll say it again. If I could set the rules, I would absolutely insist that nobody has the right to run for head of state or head of government unless they've had a dozen experiences with ayahuasca.
Hear, hear.
Let them have those experiences first. Mushrooms will do the job just as well. A dozen major doses of mushrooms will do the job just as well. Lead to that self-examination that we see so little of in our politicians today. And I think many of them would actually decide, I don't want to be a politician anymore.
Yeah.
And those who did carry on in that path would be gentler, kinder, and more open to extraordinary possibilities.
You know, we did have one president who, it's pretty lot of evidence that he did in fact take several acid trips. You know who that was?
Who's that?
John Kennedy.
Aha.
Really?
Oh yeah. You know, he was having multiple affairs in the White House, right?
I knew about that.
Okay, so one of his affairs was with a woman who was an associate of Timothy Leary. So that's well established. So there's basis to the rumor.
That's another reason why they killed him.
Could be. Well, it could be that because of, because he did really go through pretty much a change of attitude during that last year. But you know what it comes down to is, right now everything is going on in the world is basically about the control of energy and resources. And if there was a way of technology or energy that could do an end run around this idea that we live in a Malthusian reality and we have to have this, fight to the end over who's going to control the energy and who's going to control the resources, it would render our entire foreign policy, our military policy, all of that irrelevant. And from what I've seen about, and my evolving opinion about the possibility of there being ancient technology, that if there was an ancient technology, it should be possible to recover it.
Yeah.
And what I've seen in the last half a decade or more has initially skeptical, but as I've learned more, gone arduously through these patents and things, I've become convinced that, yeah, there is something here. There's something here, that there are people who have been working on these things, and they would like, my role, as they've requested to me, is these guys are academic scientists, inventors. One of them's a geophysicist. A couple of people that I've met recently who are putting the money up into this are basically in the energy industry, who have seen the prototypes. I had a meeting in September, or not September, about a month ago, early October, with 4 gentlemen that are putting the money into this, developing these prototypes. One of them said to me, well, when I first heard this, I didn't believe this was possible. But he says, I've seen the machines, I've seen the technology work. I'm now convinced. So they've done their initial prototypes, and now they're going to do this major testing. Mazda, automobile manufacturer in Japan, has come on board, said, you can use our laboratories, and because, of course, what they're thinking is that they may be able to get the end run around all the other competition. And one of the things, and when I come back, we can look into this. I've got the videos of testing the prototypes, like taking one of the gentlemen that I met with his nephew or son-in-law, mechanical engineer, who took one of the devices, and it took 4 hours. They retrofitted a internal combustion engine, because what this device does is it recycles all of the waste products, heat products, carbon dioxide, everything that's coming out of an internal combustion engine gets captured and recycled and converted back to energy. The initial test showed that the internal combustion engine went from about a 30% efficiency to 80% efficiency. And this is just the initial prototypes. I can come on your show We can look at the videos. I can show you all of it. I'd love to. So they're going to open source all of it within the next few months around the world. So they're looking for venues to put this information out because, like Malcolm there, the inventor you saw, he says, you know, this is my legacy and I want the world to have this.
So if we can, please go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, as you say, they've had to keep it secret.
Yeah.
Up till now.
Up till now.
Precisely because of the nature of the world that we live in. And I would say that we live in a system that is very controlling, that works through very clever means to control the way people think, but that the younger generation is beginning to break free of that in exciting ways. And I would say that archaeology, strangely enough, is a very important part of that system of control. If archaeologists can convince us that we are the end product of a long, steady evolution, we're the apex and the pinnacle of human achievement, then it justifies everything else that goes on in the world right now. Is any chance of pulling up the
do you think
Enemy Number One clip in a minute?
Please, we'll do that. But do you think that they're doing this in cahoots, or do you think they're doing this to protect their own personal interests? And it seems to align with these systems that are
First
currently
and foremost, to protect their own personal interests.
And their own personal interests are to express history the same way that they have always.
Yeah, I don't think that there are many archaeologists who are actually out there deliberately lying to the public. I don't think that's happening.
They're just egotistical human beings.
They're just like everybody else.
Right.
You know, you get invested in a particular line.
Yes.
It becomes existentially important to you.
It's your identity.
It's your identity.
And your knowledge defines you.
Your knowledge defines you, and if others challenge it, your first reaction is self-defense.
Yes.
You got to defend yourself against this intruder who is attacking you in one way or another. So I don't think that it's a calculated conspiracy in that way. But I do think that advantage is being taken of it by other powers, by the powers that be. I mean, I don't want to get into the whole COVID and vaccine issue too much right now. There's a lot I don't know about that. But one thing I do know for sure is that the whole COVID and vaccine issue has been deliberately, carefully used by governments. They've taken advantage of it to inculcate and encourage a habit of obedience in the population, that we just kind of automatically say yes. And that's part of the controlling powers in our society fighting back against this tendency to individuality and to thinking for ourselves. And that's why I say we live in the middle of a paradigm shift where we're in struggle right now, and either one side or the other is going to win. But I believe that the force of good is a real force, and that the ability to think freely and think independently that the younger generation is showing is going to triumph in the long run.
And what is this Enemy Number One video? Do we need to pass the sacred HDMI cable again?
Well, again, it's just I was initially really perplexed by the way archaeologists responded to me. Why would they hate me so much? Why would they be so angry with me?
Well, you're an outsider.
And yeah, I guess that's it. Simply by proposing a different point of view. So it's just another short clip from Ancient Apocalypse.
Okay.
This idea is upsetting to the so-called experts, who insist that the only humans who existed during the Ice Age were simple hunter-gatherers.
That automatically makes me enemy number one to archaeologists.
Why not just say, we don't know? This is a spectacular mystery, and leave it at that.
It's my job to offer an alternative point of view. Perhaps there's been a forgotten episode in human history, but perhaps the extremely defensive, arrogant, and patronizing attitude of mainstream academia is stopping us from considering that possibility
and trying to overthrow the paradigm of history.
Ooh, dramatic.
Very, very dramatic. dramatic. I was lucky to work with a really top class professional camera team in making this series. And talking about COVID, my goodness, I mean, to make an 8-episode TV series when the world was shut down, the number of quarantines we had to do in places like, Indonesia, in order to get this job done. But we powered through, and we got it done. And I hope that the series is going to make a difference. I'm just going to be part of that, providing an alternative source of information to people who are fed up with being told what to think by the so-called experts.
No, I'm certain it'll provide a lot of inspiration for people to think differently. Now, the possibility of this technology existing that we're talking about, existing in the past, would this technology be made with metal? Would these engines, these alternative technology engines, and if they were, we really wouldn't find evidence of them today?
I think we should be open-minded to a whole range of possibilities.
Exactly.
One of the issues that gets me into a lot of trouble with archaeologists is that I think there are latent human abilities which we are not using. I don't know if you've ever had Rupert Sheldrake on your show. So Rupert has done a lot of work on telepathy, real solid scientific work. Just like, why does your dog know when you're coming home? He did a series of controlled experiments where the owner came home at random different times of day. And the dog always knew when he was coming. Some kind of telepathic message was passing back and forward. Rupert Sheldrake has shown that telepathy is a real thing. We're thinking there's somebody, and the next second the phone rings, and it's that person. Things like that. But Rupert has done very thoroughly detailed statistical work on this and shown that it's far beyond chance, that this is a real ability that humans have, but that we're persuaded in our society to think does not exist. What about telekinesis, the ability to move objects with the mind? That sounds like Stephen King territory, but maybe we can do it. Again, our society has rested all its faith on leverage and mechanical advantage and a particular path of technology, and we've allowed what I think may be latent human abilities to fall into the abyss and not to be used anymore, so much so that we laugh at ourselves for even thinking of them. And whenever I mention things like telepathy or telekinesis, I'm not pinning my whole thesis on that. I just think it's something we should be open to. Well, if an ancient civilization were using those innate human abilities that we've forgotten how to use today, there would of course be no physical evidence for it whatsoever. There'd only be the results of what they did, like those 70-ton blocks lifted 350 feet in the air, covering the roof of the King's Chamber in the Great Pyramid. Impossible to explain in terms of leverage and mechanical advantage, but perhaps another explanation is needed.
Also so profoundly advanced in terms of their ability to move immensely huge objects that it makes you consider in a way where we're talking about, look at, even if we use the conventional dating of 2500 BC, how? Like what was available? How did they do that? Like what?
I've never seen a satisfactory explanation from the Egyptological fraternity as to how this was done. They keep coming up with multiple theories about how the Great Pyramid was built, and none of them make any sense to me. I've been lucky enough to climb the Great Pyramid 5 times. I've explored every internal passageway. This thing is just a gigantic mystery in stone. It challenges us to think again about everything in the ancient world. The fact that it incorporates the dimensions of our planet in its key dimensions, that you can take the height of the Great Pyramid and multiply by 43,200 and you get the polar radius of the Earth. You can measure the base perimeter of the Great Pyramid, multiply it by the same number, you get the equatorial circumference of the Earth. I won't bore you, but that number is not a random number. Anybody who goes into my books will find that it relates to the obscure astronomical phenomenon called precession of the equinoxes. Great Pyramid is almost perfectly aligned to true north within 3/60ths of a single degree. 13-acre footprint, 6 million tons, 481 feet high, and aligned to true north with this incredible precision. I think they're trying to tell us something. When the pyramid speaks to our planet, it speaks to this Earth, it's aligned to true north, and it's built on a scale that models the dimensions of the Earth, and that scale is derived from a key motion of the Earth itself. very, very clever. And again, I try and mention this to archaeologists. They say, it's just a coincidence. It's just rubbish. That's what they say. And it's such a lazy way to dismiss the data, rather than getting to grips with the data and saying, could this really have happened by coincidence, or is something going on here?
See, there are these key numbers that recur over and over again. We find them in the Vedas, we find them in the Bible, we find them in Mayan traditions, in Sumeria, over and over. And one of those key numbers, what Bert Graham just said, 43,200. Or, and even in the way we still measure time today, if you think about how do we measure the length of one orbit, one rotation of the Earth on its axis, the meridian lining up with the center of the sun, we've divided that into seconds, right? Minutes, hours. 24 hours is the exact period of the Earth's rotation with respect to the sun, okay? 24 hours times 60 means there's 86,400 seconds exactly in that period. On the moment of vernal equinox, the period of time of darkness and of light are exactly equal, 43,200. That number is the scaling ratio of the pyramid. If we were to take the pyramid as it is today on the Giza Plateau, enlarge it by a factor of 43,200, as Graham said, the height of it is literally within a few hundred feet of being the polar radius of the Earth. And in fact, the range of error is within the range of error of our most accurate modern satellite surveys. And we could, when I come back, I could easily demonstrate that.
We'll do that.
I put together the slides to show exactly how it's done, the geometry of the height, the ratio of the height to the square base solves the ancient geometric problem of the squaring of the circle. Because what they've basically done is that if you enlarge that pyramid by 43,200, the square base now becomes precisely the equatorial circumference of the Earth. Precisely. And just for somebody to say this is just coincidence, well, if it was one example, or two